qualified medical professionals or qualified doctors that have no license to operate in a particular jurisdiction, or are these individuals that have no medical qualifications at all and are practicing, or is it a combination of both?
Bogus doctors do not have any qualifications. Unregistered is something else. Bogus practitioners are not registered. They have not been to school. They're just chance takers. That's what a bogus doctor is. This is what we find. We don't find the certificate, let alone registration, let alone the university where they were trained. That's what we call a bogus doctor. If found guilty of practicing without having a registered with the council, culprits could, upon conviction, be liable to a fine or to imprisonment for a period of not exceeding 12 months, or both fine and imprisonment provided by the Section 39 of the Health Professions Act of South Africa.
Now, you've arrested a total of 124 of these bogus doctors over a 3-year period. Have you arrested them as a result of whistleblowers coming up and saying this individual doesn't appear to be a real doctor? Is it a case where somebody has had a prescription or an operation or procedure that hasn't quite worked out?
It's a multiplicity of issues. Yes, we do get our intelligence from communities. We do get patients who are worried about the way they were treated and the way they were examined. Some of our own colleagues do the same thing. So it's a multiplicity of sources that we are able to get information about bogus doctors.
Now, how do you, as HPCSA, emphasize the importance of safeguarding personal information for registered practitioners? Because I'd imagine the availability of this information is what allows some of these bogus individuals to couch their identities.
Well, when you've got your name as a doctor and you are nowhere in our register, our level of suspicion goes even higher. But we do have investigators who will come and visit your practice, sometimes pretend to be patients and ask a few questions, in the absence of which they are able to get with the law enforcement officers and institute an arrest. We do a lot of intelligence. You must remember, we investigate in order to arrest. We don't arrest in order to investigate. So there's a lot that goes into investigation before an arrest is made.
Dr. Mahoma Masike, Registrar, Health Professionals Council of South Africa, appreciate your time this afternoon. Well, in a moment, we go back to our team at the Brics Summit in Sandton. Don't go away.
Not being like caught doing something awkward.
From next year, the Brics bloc will be bigger by 6 and the use of local currencies for trade is going to be explored. Chaos erupted at the City of Cape Town Council sitting earlier today as the EFF disrupted proceedings calling for the axing of the Public Safety and Security MMC JP Smith. And yesterday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi celebrated the landing of an Indian spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, and since then the rover has been sending pictures back to Earth. Stephen Krutos is at the Brics conference in St. Louis unpacking a number of conversations that have been had. Stephen, good afternoon.
Hugo, thank you very much indeed. Yes, good afternoon to you. Well, of course, the big announcement, as you know, the 6 new nations that will be joining Brics with effect from the 1st of January next year. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and of course Argentina. So now we have 11 members of the Brics. They haven't quite drawn up a new acronym yet, but I imagine that a name will emerge in the next little while. They better do it themselves before Twitter does it for them. Also, of course, big conversations around, as you say, whether or not these countries can trade with each other in local currencies. Perhaps one of the instruments of all of this will be the new development bank. Saudi Arabian money is suddenly available for the new development bank. Ethiopia might want some of that for development. We might want some of that for development. Just some of the questions that are coming out today. And then perhaps one of the quotes that I think is going to come back again and again. A quote which you're likely to see whenever people talk about our politics and our president. It comes from the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, where he said, "I would like to point out that President Ramaphosa showed unique political mastery as we negotiated all these issues, even the Brics expansion." That's from the Russian president to our president. Very interesting. Chipipa Mpango is, of course, the chief economist at the Don Consultancy Group, Sanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. Good afternoon to you both. Vladimir Putin may not have grown up in a democracy. In fact, he grew up in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He certainly knows, Sanusha, a good politician when he sees one.
Yeah, it's a bromance that's happening. And I think, you know, in a sense, it tells you that they can be very flattering to each other. They can be very charming to each other as the Brics leaders. They keep calling themselves, and President Ramaphosa iterated this, the coin now is the Brics family, and how this Brics family starts to evolve, and you mentioned the new members and what the acronym will be. I don't think X, formerly known as Twitter, will essentially be that space. But I think it raises questions around how you're going to access finance. That's a big question as well. I mean, does this mean now that you get cheaper finance because you're a member of the Brics? Does it mean that, for example, a country like Argentina, whose economic distress is so real right now in terms of where they are in their inflation, in their currency volatility, in their food prices, the economy is just, you know, at a really serious inflection point. Do they go to the IMF for the bailout, or will they look towards the Brics, the new development bank? And these are key questions around how did you measure, how would you construct the kind of engagement around the loan. And one of the things that the Brics have also put into place, and I think they need to think about how this is now financed even further, is the contingency reserve arrangement. That was to actually help Brics countries in terms of the contribution they made to when they needed that emergency equity and liquidity.
It's interesting, Chipipa, because families are supposed to lend money to each other. They also fight over money, unfortunately. So this does actually need to be managed very carefully, doesn't it? And I'm sure it will be.
It will have to be managed carefully. I think, to me, it's more around the transition of what the new development bank will actually later on become. I think it's I'm seeing a situation whereby at this stage, it's like a first initial stage of its development. Because if you look at its focus now, it's only focusing on projects, infrastructure projects, energy projects, and so forth. But I think as it revolves, there might even be need for even budgetary support for some countries, especially when it comes to the issue of, they're trying to move in the space of, let's say, the IMF, where it's focused on those kind of lending to other countries. And I think where the advantage of the new development bank might come in here is on the issue of the kind of conditions that they might be placing for the new countries which they will be coming to borrow from the new development bank. Because the biggest criticism that were faced around these big multilateral institutions like IMF and World Bank is the conditions that they put on the ground in terms of what needs to be happening. Because surely the conditions should be about development. But if you bring in other issues such as politics into the conditions of the loan, then it becomes a bit disruptive in terms of the ability for those countries even to achieve the objectives. So that is something I think we need to look at in terms of the new development bank becoming a real institution that is focusing on development, that leaves the politics of the countries alone and focusing on in terms of the needs of the people in those countries.
So much to look at with all of this. Our business editor, Kolani Mbanjwa, has been watching it all very closely here at the Brics Summit in Sandton as well. Kolani, good afternoon to you. Well, I don't need to tell you this. The two big issues today, the Brics expansion, the 6 new members, and, of course, the idea of trading in local currencies.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Yes, indeed, the two big issues that we spoke about here on Newzroom Africa on day one, they have been resolved, with the expansion of Brics being a massive talking point. And of course, I expect that in the next few weeks, months, Brics at 15th Summit is going to be topical. It's going to be one thing that many news outlets, many political formations, and many world organizations are going to be analyzing, because it is growing. Now that it is growing in January 2024 to 11 members, that is quite an important part. And what we need to hear from the leadership here at the end of this particular day 3 is what is going to be happening between now and January, when those countries actually join. What was a surprise is Saudi Arabia. We had expected that Saudi Arabia would be among those countries whose applications would have been considered, but it's been quite an interesting time here, looking at the international media that is here, international analysts that are here, trying to figure out exactly what this means for the geopolitical movements in the entire world. There's still a lot of hive of activity here, with many movements of leaders in and out, but the number one thing on that expansion is what the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa, said earlier today in that declaration, announcing the formal declaration about Brics Plus. We don't know what it's going to be called, but this is what he had to say.
We have consensus on the first phase of this expansion process, and other phases will follow. We have decided to invite the Argentine Republic, the Arab Republic of Egypt, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to become full members of Brics. The membership will take effect from the 1st of January 2024.
But of course, Stephen, you will know that the use of local currencies when it comes to trade is probably the most topical issue here, the most important issue, and that is because when you look at the fact that countries like Saudi Arabia would want to actually trade in their local currency, even the news outlets have been saying that the United States has actually begged the Saudi Arabia as an exporter of oil not to use new currencies, but to stick to the US dollar. The dollar is going to be a talking point in the next couple of months, because this is a big, big move. What does it mean for BRICS countries? It will be fostering that unity amongst them, but strengthening the local currencies as well. And there will be a lot of analysis coming over the next couple of months about what this means for South Africa. Will the rand, which it has been said is not valued according to its right value, because it is undervalued, even if you ask the Reserve Bank Governor, Lesetja Kganyago, he believes strongly that the rand is undervalued. So the use of local currencies is going to be a big talking point, and this is what President Ramaphosa had to say earlier on when announcing that particular decision.
We have noted that there is global momentum for the use of local currencies, alternative financial arrangements, and alternative payment systems. As BRICS, we are ready to explore opportunities for improving the stability, reliability, and fairness of the global financial architecture. In this regard, BRICS leaders have tasked their finance ministers and central bank governors, as appropriate, to consider the issue of local currencies, payment instruments, and platforms, and to report back to the BRICS leaders by the next summit.
The 15th BRICS Summit has been described by some as bold in its moves to move towards de-dollarization, something that the whole world is looking at, and it's going to threaten the dominance of the United States in global politics, particularly when it comes to the US dollar being the benchmark for most trades around the world. These moves are quite big, and it's going to be huge talking points over the coming months. Back to you, Stephen, in studio.
Kolani and Bandra, thanks very much indeed. Shafifa Mango with us still, the chief economist at the Don Consultancy Group, also Tanusha Naidu from the Institute for Global Dialogue. So, interesting, yes, this is going to be a big talking point. How are Western capitals, how are the United States, Tanusha, going to respond to all of this? We're literally seeing people like Antonio Guterres today talking about redrawing the map of global governance.
I think they've been jostled. They've been jostled in the sense that it's now, you can't move back. It's happened. I think in the build-up to this summit and the question of whether or not the expansion was going to happen and in what kind of context it was going to happen, kind of now the moment has arrived. It's been done. The die has been cast. And the real challenge, I think, for Washington and their partners outside of the spaces that we see, particularly in the UN as well, is what does this mean going forward? Because now you've got to think about, where does this go? Does Washington call Antonio Guterres in and say, did you really say what you said at the BRICS summit in terms of noting that the time has come for a new global order or a global governance recheck or a reconfiguration, that it's there, you can't move in the same kind of circles? I mean, these are also the issues around why the global governance institutional architecture was in need of some kind of a check. Because who controls the IMF, who controls the World Bank, etc.?
So much to look at. Right. Well, earlier today, Professor Anil Suklal, he's an ambassador at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. He's our ambassador to BRICS, also the ambassador to South Asia. He spoke earlier to Romela, my colleague.
We need to have had a structured approach to it, an inclusive approach. So firstly, we needed to agree on criteria, standards and procedure, and that took quite a bit of time because we all had to be sure that whatever we do within BRICS add value to BRICS. So having developed that and finalized it through consensus that was adopted by our ministers firstly and yesterday by our leaders, that paved the way then to look at the countries that had formerly asked to become part of BRICS and to look at the first phase of expansion. You must understand that this is, as President Ramaphosa indicated, it's the first phase of expansion, and we needed to see that we find consensus in terms of the countries that have been put forward, and eventually yesterday we were able to agree on the 6 countries that was announced this morning by President Ramaphosa, and it was an inclusive process and everyone felt comfortable with the names that ultimately was agreed upon.
Did these countries apply?
All of them apply.
And what was the criteria? You mentioned the criteria that was needed in order to select these countries. What was considered?
Well, some of the issues, it's quite extensive, that will also be made available. The countries had to firstly agree to all of the current agreements that are in place between the 5 of us, and the values and principles that we espouse to. They had to agree to that, and also take on board all of what has happened in Brics thus far, take ownership of it, so that whatever we have achieved thus far is also something that they agree with. So this is some of the areas. They also had to be, in terms of the global and regional standing, occupy an important post in their respective regions. So these were some of the issues that we looked at.
Economic standing, was that a factor?
Economic standing was also part of the issue, that they had to be in good economic standing and add value to Brics.
Population, was that a factor?
Not really. Population was not. As you can see, we're quite diverse. We are 60 million. India and China is 1 plus 4 billion plus. So it wasn't a factor. But we also tried to look at regional representation. So that is why you'd see that we have a member from Latin America, 2 from Africa, and 3 from the Middle East. So that also gives greater diversity to the Brics family.
That interview recorded a little earlier today. Well, joining me now is the Minister in the Presidency, Kubunso Nchibeni. Minister, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. I know you've all been very busy. Everyone's been awake all hours of the day. In a way, this must be seen as, I think, for the moment, a victory for South Africa. This has happened here. Brics has been expanded. We've had a lot of praise already from various heads of state for President Ramaphosa and for the way this has been managed. How are you feeling after everything that's happened?
We were quite elated about the declaration, what was achieved, but also for hosting a format that is a new format of getting the Global South to be part of Brics in particular. Africa has participated in large numbers. We are in the Africa Outreach Program now with the presidents of the whole, in the whole continent almost, as speaking and present here. We feel honored, but also our message about multilateralism and also fostering collaboration and also making sure the positions of the countries of the Global South and in Africa in particular are supported, and the growth of Africa is supported in a way that is sustainable and there's development. We are quite happy with the effort, so we don't mind the sleepless nights.
What was happening in the background? Because it's very difficult for us to know. You've done very well in keeping us 2 floors away from everyone. But very difficult to know what was happening in terms of the negotiations. I mean, how did you decide these 6 countries, for example?
So remember, the principle of the expansion had to be agreed on first. Yeah. So the first achievement was agreeing on the principles of expansion and the criterion of the expansion. And therefore, when you have done the criterion, and when the principle is agreed, you then say, what is the criterion and how does that unfold, the modalities. And then the countries, how they were decided, is the same principle of saying, the countries that are willing to work in support and to achieve multilateralism, the countries that are supportive of the reform of the UN multilateral system is important, and just to bring inclusivity in terms of the representation, because our issue as South Africa in terms of the UN system is that it's not reform to be inclusive. It doesn't represent all of us. We are not equals. But if you want to foster true multilateralism, there must be representation. Everyone must feel represented in one form or the other. So that's the basis of which this membership was decided now. The Ministers of Foreign Affairs and International Relations are going to work on the modalities of the partnerships to say what are the partner countries, how do we get them coming through to be partner countries, because you know of the 20 countries that applied, others said we want to be partners. Others, they said, we want to join later. We're not yet ready. And that's the criteria they're going to work with. But we are quite happy with the progress, and that the Johannesburg II Declaration it announces such major achievements over and above the other areas of collaboration and cooperation that were agreed to.
Do you think more countries could be admitted as early as the next summit in sort of a year, 2 years' time?
I would not want to throw a guess, but I know that in the next summit we may the leaders will consider the partnerships, what are the partner countries that are coming through. But from the 1st of January 2024, the 6 countries come through.
If I remember correctly, you actually gave a presentation about security issues. And there is quite a lot in the declaration about the fight against terrorism, about those concerns. Are you expecting the BRICS countries plus the new BRICS countries, are we calling it BRICS?
It's still BRICS.
Okay.
It's still BRICS now.
Are we expecting the BRICS countries to work more closely together on security issues? And this is quite complex and quite important all at the same time.
Yes, it's important that we work together on security issues, and the issues that we considered is not only counter-terrorism, it's cyber-security, food security, electricity or energy security in our instance. We've considered and climate change impact because they've become important. So we have to work. It's not a question of if we're going to work closely. We have to work closely with each other because even the nature of cybercrime, the nature of terrorism, it has become global. If we wake up one day, we may not have terrorism on our account, but we may find that we are harboring or we are hosting people in our country that are financing terrorism. And therefore it's important that we work closely together, more so for the stability of the African continent as well.
The fact that we will be working more closely together with these countries, so Russia, China, India, Argentina, etc., is that going to change any of the working relationships we have with regards to security around, say, the United States or whoever else?
Not at all. So, and this is what we have been clarifying, that the BRICS is not a replacement for our bilateral relationships with countries. And we have been clarifying that since forever, to say it doesn't replace anybody. It's a working relationship that we need to strengthen with this group of countries. We have other relationships as a nation. Our focus is on national interests of South Africa and South Africans and African interests in general. And therefore our relationships with the US, with the UK, with France, with the UN itself is not replaced. And BRICS is not a replacement of the United Nations.
It's not, but BRICS is clearly leading to reform. Antonio Guterres' statement that the world has changed, we need reform, the way that the world is governed must change. I mean, I think he might have said that before, but still for him to say it here is a strong statement. BRICS is completely united behind that. Do you believe that there's now going to be momentum to actually change how the United Nations works?
We've got new members. We're no longer just 5 countries. So we are from January we'll be 11 countries. So we'll get more voice to support the agenda of reform that South Africa in particular and Africa in general have been very vocal on it. We've been driving the issues of reform, whether it's at the WTO, the UN Security Council. We've been very vocal. And on this particular one, we are very clear and insistent on the reform of the Security Council so that it can represent the aspirations of the world, it can represent the demographics of the world. You cannot exclude the largest populations of the world from sitting in the National Security Council. It doesn't make sense. And it's good that the Secretary General of the UN reiterates that statement here. It means that we've got an ally in terms of our agenda to reform the Security Council and the UN system in general to reflect true multilateralism.
For someone watching this, the most likely thing they're going to think about is how does it affect me? And if you look at what's happening in our country at the moment with inflation and food price inflation and load shedding, we know the impact this will have with load shedding. We've seen the agreement signed with China and all of that. But for things like food prices, you would like to think that this is going to see more development coming to our country, perhaps through the new development bank, more infrastructure spending, and in the end, a better life. Do you think that those mechanisms are beginning to come into place? Is that going to happen as a result of this?
Those mechanisms are beginning to come into place, and just for correction, we released the inflation rates. It's quite low.
Well, onions are still 55%.
No, but the impact, remember, the net effect will take a while to factor in, but there's been an improvement in our own economy. But in terms of this, remember, when you are in the group of nations of BRICS, the trading relations increase. Therefore, markets, for instance, China just announced the lifting of the ban on our beef export to China, which is significant on its own. Our ability to get funding from the new development bank, and if you remember, they've raised bonds in using South African rands, which are going to be used to invest in infrastructure development here. So it means the more we develop, the more we implement projects, the more people get employment, the more opportunities for young people, but the more the prices will go down, because then the value of the rand also increases. But where we are, we think our trading partners, now you've got a team of 11 who will work every day to say, oh, why are you choosing that and not choosing one of our own? Because that's what a family does. We're a family of Brics, and therefore our opportunities to trade with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with Egypt, with Ethiopia, with Argentina, over and above our relationship, the increasing of the relations, trade relations with Brazil, for example, with China, with Russia, with India. It's just more beneficial to South Africans in terms of economic growth, but it's also in terms of being able to tap into expertise in other countries, and in our ability to send South Africans for exchanges, our abilities to cooperate in terms of technical expertise exchanges, our companies investing in their countries, and their countries' businesses investing in South Africa.
Don't mention chicken to Brazil. Okay, I think you can probably agree. There was a very interesting quote today, and I think people are going to be looking at this quote for a long time. It came from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said, "I would like to point out that President Ramaphosa showed unique political mastery as we negotiated all the issues, even the Brics expansion." How do you read that? You work for him.
I think I've had the advantage of knowing him when I was still very young. And
Putin or Ramaphosa?
Ramaphosa, of course, my own president. And so the mastery every day, because I live under his shadow. Every day I have the privilege of sitting in meetings where he articulates. Every day I'm not shocked or surprised. I'm just in awe of the man. And all of you, when we started, even the initiatives when we were doing to bring the peace initiative in the Ukraine-Russia, you never believed us. And when we started to say this is the progress, this is the children issues are being resolved, the prisoners of all issues are being resolved, other areas we're working on collaborating, you never believed us. And here it is, the world is confirming to you. The largest economies are confirming to you. The UN Secretary General is confirming to you that we've got a good leader in President Ramaphosa, and that he is for not only for global peace, but for the best interest of this country.
Minister Kumbutso Nsuveni, a minister in the presidency, may I say a very loyal minister in the presidency. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I really appreciate it. Our live coverage of the Brics Summit, the Johannesburg II Declaration, and the expansion of Brics here in Sandton will continue through the afternoon. Do stay with us.
Gustavo, good afternoon.
Fantastic, thank you. Good afternoon.
Gustavo, can you hear me?
I can hear you well. Can you hear me?
Very clearly, thank you.
Hello.
My name is Hugo. I'm going to be chatting to you in a moment. Okay, cool. From next year, the Brics bloc will be bigger by 6, and the use of local currencies for trade is going to be explored. Chaos erupted at a City of Cape Town Council sitting earlier today as the EFF disrupted proceedings calling for the axing of the Public Safety and Security MMC, JP Smith. And yesterday, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi celebrated the landing of an Indian spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, and since then the rover has been sending pictures back to Earth. Let's look at the implications of the including the 6 into the Brics summit, into the Brics countries, I beg your pardon. Now I'm joined by Gustavo de Carvalho, senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Gustavo, appreciate your time this afternoon. Now, this is a major development. What is your immediate reaction to the number being 11 at the start of 2024?
I think it was certainly a very interesting result from the summit, particularly considering that until yesterday at this time of the day, we were not even sure whether the members would be able to get consensus regarding the expansion. As we know, Brazil was quite concerned about, and what we are looking into the new countries now of countries like Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. They are seen for various different reasons as being potentially supportive to the goals of Brics, particularly when it comes to reforming and changing international financial institutions, and also with the ongoing discussions regarding the use of local currency in trade. Particularly when we look into the 3 countries within the 3 Gulf states that are joining BRICS, they will bring a much needed liquidity for the group, and especially if we would like to see increasing levels of trade being done in local currencies, but those local currencies need to be traded somehow. They need to be available. They need to be liquid in the sense that countries will be able to find that particular mechanism useful. So I think it's an interesting state. There is a lot of questions regarding weather dynamics in Argentina, for instance, and also
Okay, we seem to have lost Gustavo, but as the 15th BRICS summit draws to a close, Police Minister Ebrahim Patel says he's satisfied with the smooth sailing of the event with regards to security. This year's gathering, which was the first in person since the COVID-19 pandemic, attracted at least 40 heads of state from BRICS and several other countries from the African continent. In the build-up to the summit, security in and around the Sandton Convention Centre was tightened, with extra personnel deployed to the area. Even though Patel has kept mum on the number of officers deployed to the event, he says is pleased with the security measures implemented.
Well, we do have experience to do. Remember 2010 World Cup was here. Stayed with us longer time, almost a month. Maybe the profile of the teams could not reach the profile that we have today when the whole world at the level of the head of states descends on you. It does give you some sleepless nights, but we have collected together all those experiences. It's not the first time that the BRICS is here. Many other big things that we have organized before. But up to this point, we feel very good. They are beginning to file up. I'm told that Indonesia left this morning. Tonight, the biggest delegation, I guess, is leaving China. Not out of the woods, as I've said, but up to this point, we're fine.
Chaos erupted at a City of Cape Town City Council sitting earlier today as the EFF disrupted proceedings calling for the axing of the Public Safety and Security MMC, JP Smith. The Red Berets are also calling for the release of taxis impounded by the city. A scuffle then ensued between security officials and EFF members, which led to DA members leaving the chambers. This is the city's first council meeting following the deadly week-long taxi stay-away. Last week, the Western Cape High Court dismissed Santaco's bid to interdict the Western Cape and City of Cape Town to stop taxi impoundment. Meanwhile, in his opening speech at the City Council debate, Mayor Jordan Hill-Lewis reflected on Santaco's violent 2-week stay-away. At least 5 people were killed during the strike and thousands of commuters were left stranded.
For 4 difficult days, our city was plunged into chaos as Santaco withdrew its services in the Western Cape and their strike turned inevitably, as it always does, to deadly violence. And still 4 days after that, the strike persisted. And although the violence stopped, the intimidation of food truck drivers continued, actively trying to stop food from reaching poor communities in the city. 2 weeks have now passed since the strike was called off, and we've had time to reflect on what transpired that week. So I'd like in this debate to set out the chain of events from my vantage point, and then offer my thoughts on the lessons we can learn. For months and months prior to the strike, the city and the Western Cape government were engaged with Santaco in talks to resolve grievances that they had raised over the impounding of vehicles, the availability of licenses, the continuation of the Blue Dot project, and other issues. Claiming that their vehicles were being unfairly targeted, and their drivers, Santaco then withdrew from those talks 3 weeks ago. That withdrawal was unilateral. At this point, it is useful to familiarize ourselves with the laws in question, because there's been so much misdirection on this issue that many people struggle to make sense of it. And I want us to read the law together so we're familiar with it.
EFF's Ntsikelelo Jalandela says that they had a peaceful protest with banners calling for a stop to the impounding of taxis.
We had to demonstrate the feeling on the ground and the feeling of us as political parties of what is happening currently within the JP Smith office, the abuse of power by the DA, outside City of Cape Town Council, even inside today was demonstrated that the abuse of power by the DA, it cannot continue anymore. And as you can see today, we've got other opposition political parties that joined the EFF when we started our peaceful protest. And once again, the Speaker of the House used her powers incorrectly to chase us out, where the Mayor has said, no, he is fine with our peaceful protest.
We'll now take you back to the Sandton Convention Centre, where Minister Ebrahim Patel is briefing the media.
Well, the African continent has to have a component of manufacturing goods here on the African continent.
Minister, one of the reflections that were discussed at the presentation that was done at the JSE was the Chinese consumer, or rather investor confidence index. May I kindly ask, because that project was done in collaboration with the Bank of China, what was the determination to partner with the Bank of China specifically?
So the Industrial Development Corporation is South Africa's leading public investment agency that's aimed at industrialization, precisely because we've been talking to China about increasing the level of investment in things like manufacturing, productive services and so on. The obvious partnership was between the Bank of China and the Industrial Development Corporation. It's not the only one. We've also signed an agreement with the China-Africa Development Fund, and we will be engaging with a range of Chinese financial institutions. In November, China will be hosting the China International Import Expo in Shanghai, and that's another opportunity to reach out to the Chinese capital markets. China has a growing and quite deep capital market, and we have great opportunities here on the African continent to use that capital in productive and profitable investment. And that match is what that partnership is about.
Now, this year involves 11 nations. How has the government's position on the global arena changed?
What we have now is a bigger number of people, a bigger market, a bigger investable capability, and that will mean that Brics' weight in the global economy has clearly increased. Our job now is to ensure that out of that Brics membership, this combined membership, we're able to ensure value to every Brics member. Ultimately, citizens look to us for more jobs, for more investment, for more opportunities for small business. So this is a game changer in bringing together the economies of the South and connecting them much more. Think about it. Within all of those economies, you've got enormous resources of raw materials, you have huge pools of capital and technology, you've got a large labor force. More than 45% of the world's labor force is now in Brics. Those are important opportunities that Brics can play to and ensure growth in the global economy, because it's not only Brics that will benefit from it. It's not only Brics Plus that will benefit. When Brics does well, the global economy too gets a dividend in increased growth, because with growth goes increased aggregate demand. We suck in products from other parts outside the BRICS family, and that is good for citizens all over the world.
South Africa's Minister of Trade, Ebrahim Patel, speaking to the media on the back of the BRICS summit and making some key announcements on some of the agreements that have been taken by the BRICS countries. Now, international stories and sports when we return in a moment. Don't go away.
Hello. I can, loud and clear. Do you need me in front of the camera? Okay, no worries.
In news from further afield, it's unclear what the news of Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's possible death means for the African countries where his soldiers operate. The Wagner mercenary group leader's influence has become widespread on the continent. Pro-Wagner group imagery has become mainstays in pro-coup and anti-Western protests in Mali, Burkina Faso, and most recently Niger. On Monday, video footage circulated showing Prigozhin apparently in Africa. In the video, Prigozhin vowed to make the continent freer. The group maintains a strong military presence in Africa, where it has partnered with several nations, including Mali, Libya, Sudan, and the Central African Republic.
Russian authorities say mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin was listed as a passenger in a fatal plane crash, about 2 months after the mutiny he led that brought the country into a crisis. This unverified video from a Russian news outlet is said to show the moment of the crash. Reuters used satellite and street view images to confirm the clip's location, but could not immediately confirm that Prigozhin was physically on board the aircraft. According to Russian authorities, the crash happened Wednesday evening north of Moscow, leaving no survivors. 10 people were on board the plane heading from Moscow to St. Petersburg. 3 of them crew members. State media is reporting that 8 bodies were initially found at the crash site, with search and rescue operations underway. Data from online tracker FlightRadar24.com shows a plane heading northwest and then shortly after 6 p.m., suddenly disappearing. Prigozhin soared in prominence after Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. The 62-year-old's fighters led the assault on the city of Bakhmut in the longest and bloodiest battle of the war. In June, he spearheaded a mutiny against Russia's top army brass. President Vladimir Putin said that move could have tipped the country into civil war. He was supposed to move to neighboring Belarus under an apparent deal to end the mutiny. U.S. President Joe Biden said he wasn't surprised to hear the news.
There's not much that happens in Russia that Putin's not behind. I don't know enough to know the answer.
There was no immediate comment from Russia's defense ministry or the Kremlin.
We take you back now to the Santon Convention Centre, where India's Foreign Secretary Vijay Kwame is briefing the media on the country's visit to South Africa on the back of the country's moon landing.
And later in the evening yesterday, the dinner and the cultural event hosted by the Honourable President of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa. Today, as I just mentioned a little while ago, the BRICS leaders are currently participating in the BRICS Africa Outreach and the BRICS Plus Dialogue, which 65 countries across Africa, Asia and Latin America. In his address today to the Brics Africa outreach and to the Brics Plus event, Honorable Prime Minister highlight what he is a very strong believer in, and he has led this right from the front, is what the BRICS brings on the table for the global south, for the larger global south. Honorable Prime Minister himself led the first Voice of Global South Summit ever earlier in January this year, ahead of substantive and intense engagement of G20 leadership beginning. And the whole idea was to really understand from the countries of the global south as to what are their priorities, what are their concerns, what do they want from G20 which is of value to them. Yes, some of the countries of the global south are a member of G20, but most of them are not. What are their developmental priorities? How do they see financing from the world for their developmental priorities across different areas? And that's, in a way, he sort of captured a very distilled sense of it in his remarks today. And he also emphasized, as he himself has been, that BRICS should also be a voice for global south, for the larger global south, not just for the priorities of the BRICS countries themselves. And he also stated what has always been one of the driving impulses of India's policy, which is a close partnership with Africa and to be a very strong, reliable and a dependent partner of Africa's development journey. In terms of bilateral engagements on the sidelines of the BRICS summit, Prime Minister met with President Ramaphosa yesterday, first thing in the morning before the summit proceedings began, and today held bilateral meetings with leaders from Ethiopia, Senegal, Iran, and the last one was Mozambique. Later this evening, he is also expected to meet some of the thought leaders, I am told, from South Africa. We all witnessed yesterday a historic occasion, and Honorable Prime Minister joined millions of Indians and the entire global community to watch the historic, flawless moment of landing of Vikram rover of Chandrayaan-3, soft landing on the surface of the moon. And he joined this momentous event through video conferencing, and as we all heard, subsequently addressed the nation regarding this scintillating achievement of India and Indian science and technology. Prime Minister was very warmly received, as again we saw right on the day of his arrival, by the Indian community and Indian diaspora here. And another round of welcome and felicitation was there yesterday in the evening after the successful landing of Chandrayaan. A major outcome of the BRICS summit, as the Honorable President of South Africa highlighted in the press briefing earlier this afternoon, is the decision of the BRICS leaders to expand its membership to include 6 new members. These 6 members are Argentina, as was announced, Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. As my Prime Minister has said, India has been fully supportive of the BRICS expansion based on whatever consensus is arrived at between the BRICS member countries. We would like to believe that expansion of the BRICS would make it stronger, will bring in the value proposition of the 6 new members to the functioning and to the engagement, intra-BRICS engagement. If I was to capture what Honorable Prime Minister said across his various remarks in terms of specifics, I would say he broadly made, across different sessions, 15 broad key points. And the significance of these 15 points is that they are, one, very, very deeply anchored in India's own capabilities, India's own economic growth and potential, and 2, they interface in a very, very complementary way with the countries of the Global South, economies of the Global South, in terms of our cooperative structures in which this operates. Just to briefly, and also an element which is that how the overall international ecosystem of partnerships, cooperation, particularly the UN reforms, are significant. So if I was to just very quickly run through these 15 key points, first being a need to define timelines for the UN Security Council reforms. Two, something which we have been pushing very strongly even in the G20, the need to reform multilateral financial institutions. Why so? Because that's one of the key needs of developmental financing for the developing world. Three, reform of WTO, long-standing, seemingly not moving. Four, which we already achieved a successful outcome today.
We break away from that briefing by the Indian delegation here at the Brics Summit in Joburg on the day of the announcement, of course, that Brics will expand from the 1st of January next year by 6 new members. We bring you back now to our main headquarters, our main broadcast point in Sandton, the main point, of course, of where all of the discussions and negotiations have been taking place. And we bring you to a conversation with one of the people who's been playing a really key role in the last few days, and I suspect in the weeks and months before that as well. I'm talking about our Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Ebrahim Patel. Minister, good afternoon. Thanks very much indeed for your time. You must be exhausted.
Well, Stephen, we're thrilled at how well things are going. Of course, the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating. But we've laid a really solid foundation over the last few days. And it's been 1 year of work to get to the point where there's a convergence of thinking about expansion of Brics. And as important that we have these different streams. In my case, I've had a meeting with all of the trade ministers and separately with the industry ministers to lay the basis for improving collaboration in these two key areas.
I was going to say that automatically this must at this moment be seen as quite a big success, what's happened here in the last 24 but really 48 hours. Obviously, as you say, the proof is in the eating. But for the moment, I mean, it seems that South Africa's come out of all of this pretty well. It's gone well. There's expansion. There's announcements. There seems to be general broad agreement. What's the magic word? Consensus on all of these things. As hosts, I mean, government should be pretty pleased.
We are. And I think it's tribute to the President. I mean, this is one of the areas that he's been particularly successful in connecting both the African agenda and the global agenda through Brics. And you can see the chemistry between him and the different leaders here, the way in which he's been able to broker through some tricky areas and get a consensus to move forward. And as South Africa, we think it's helped to focus and put a spotlight on our country, but also our continent. In a world that is fragmenting, that's much more polarized than we've seen in the past, there's an opportunity here for South Africa to make the argument that global trade and global investment is important, and that we need an open architecture, that trying to reduce trade and investment to things that only happen between friends is not a good thing. But at the same time, within that global agenda, we need to increase the focus on the global south, to address the enormous challenges of unemployment and the boost to the global economy that can come from more dynamic economies in the global south. So Brics has allowed us to do that, to argue for openness. This is not an exclusive arrangement where we're seeking only to trade with each other. At the same time, it's taking some powerful voices from different continents, welding them together into a common idea about what should happen. So we think this has been an incredibly successful Brics conference. For 3 years, Brics didn't meet in person. The last physical meeting was in 2019 in Brasilia. But there's no question about it, that if you look back over the last 6, 7, 8 years, this is, with no question about it, the most significant Brics summit that has been held.
We see, of course, you know, as I say, we're 2 floors away from everyone. We see the statements